Tunisia, early 1943. The scene playing out in countless panzer crews across North Africa followed a familiar pattern. German tankers, protected by thick armour that had proven invulnerable to British anti-tank rifles, felt a confidence born from real combat success. The 60 millimeters of frontal armour on vehicles like the Panzer IV had consistently turned enemy rounds into harmless sparks. Intelligence reports mentioned some new American weapon, a tube infantry carried on their shoulders. Based on what German crews knew about existing Allied anti-tank rifles, this hardly seemed threatening. Then came something that would shatter that confidence across the theatre. Not the sharp crack of an anti-tank gun they'd learned to recognize, not the whistle of artillery they knew to fear. This was different. A whooshing roar from an unexpected angle. What followed transformed the relationship between infantry and armour. The invincible Panzers discovered they were vulnerable to a weapon so simple that German engineers would initially struggle to believe the after-action reports. A weapon that could be carried by a single soldier and fired without the complex equipment of traditional anti-tank guns. They called it the bazooka. And experiences like this, repeated across the North African and later European theatres, would teach the Wehrmacht an expensive lesson about underestimating American innovation. The pattern was consistent enough to force doctrinal changes, urgent development programs, and a fundamental reassessment of infantry anti-tank capabilities. They called it the bazooka, and it was about to teach the Wehrmacht a very expensive lesson about underestimating American innovation. The crisis, when infantry became prey. To understand why the bazooka was revolutionary, you need to understand the nightmare that preceded it. In the early years of World War II, Allied infantry lived in terror of tanks. German panzers weren't just weapons. They were psychological instruments of conquest, rolling fortresses that seemed unstoppable to men armed with rifles and grenades. The Allies had anti-tank weapons, of course. The British fielded the Boy's anti-tank rifle, a shoulder-fired monster that could penetrate early tank armour. But it was a brutal weapon to use. The recoil could break collarbones. And by 1941, German armour had evolved beyond its penetration capability. Firing a Boy's rifle at a Panzer IV was an exercise in futility and suicide. The armour was simply too thick. The Americans had experimented with similar weapons. The M1941 Johnson rifle. Various anti-tank rifle designs borrowed or copied from European models. All suffered the same fundamental problem. Conventional armor-piercing rounds relied on kinetic energy. The faster and harder you could throw a projectile, the more armor it could penetrate. But there were physical limits. Make the gun too powerful, and a human couldn't carry or fire it. Make the round too heavy, and it wouldn't fly straight or far enough. Meanwhile, German tank development was accelerating in the opposite direction. The Panzer III gave way to the Panzer IV. Then came the true monsters, the Tiger I, with frontal armor up to 100 millimeters thick. The Panther, with sloped armor that could deflect even powerful anti-tank gun rounds. These weren't just incremental improvements. They represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between infantry and armor. American soldiers in North Africa learned this the hard way. You could hide in a foxhole with your M1 Garand and watch panzers roll past, knowing you were utterly powerless. The tanks could see you. They could kill you. And there was nothing you could do about it. Towed anti-tank guns helped, but they were heavy, difficult to conceal, and required multiple crew members. They certainly couldn't keep pace with advancing infantry. The doctrinal solution was to call in artillery or air support, but in fluid combat situations, that wasn't always possible. The psychological impact was devastating. Infantry doctrine depends on the infantryman believing he has agency, that his weapons and training give him a fighting chance. But against German armor, American soldiers felt helpless. This wasn't combat. It was waiting to be crushed or machine-gunned by an enemy you couldn't fight back against. By 1942, the problem was critical. The US Army needed a portable anti-tank weapon that a single soldier could carry, aim, and fire effectively. It needed to penetrate the thick armor of modern German tanks. It needed to be simple enough for conscript soldiers to use under stress. And ideally, it needed to be cheap and quick to manufacture, because America would need thousands of them. The solution would come from an unlikely combination: rocket science pioneers' research, shaped charge physics, and the desperate innovation that only total war can inspire. The story of the bazooka begins with a foundation laid decades earlier. Robert Goddard, America's pioneering rocket scientist, had demonstrated an early tube-launched rocket weapon at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in November 1918, just days before the World War I armistice. Though that conflict ended before his weapon saw combat, his fundamental research into solid-fuel rockets and his successful demonstration of tube-launching principles would prove valuable decades later. One of Goddard's assistants from that World War I work, Dr. Clarence Hickman, would provide crucial continuity when the military revisited rocket weapons in World War II. Enter Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Uhl, two Army Ordnance Corps officers assigned in 1942 to develop a practical infantry anti-tank weapon. Working under urgent deadlines as American entry into the North African campaign approached, they faced the challenge of delivering the newly developed M10 shaped charge grenade, effective against armor but too heavy to throw, to enemy tanks. Skinner and Uhl understood the key insight that would make the bazooka revolutionary. You didn't need kinetic energy if you had the right warhead. This is where the shaped charge, also called the Monroe effect, after its discoverer, entered the picture. The physics is counterintuitive. Take a hollow charge of explosive with a conical metal liner, detonate it, and the liner collapses inward, forming a superplastic jet of metal that moves at hypersonic speeds. This jet doesn't rely on the kinetic energy of a projectile. Instead, it creates a focused armor-piercing stream of metal plasma that can burn through steel like a cutting torch through butter. The British had experimented with shaped charges in grenades and mines. But delivering a shaped charge required solving a problem. The explosive needed to detonate at a precise distance from the target for maximum effect. Too close or too far, and penetration dropped dramatically. A thrown grenade was unreliable. An artillery shell was overkill and imprecise. But a rocket? A rocket could carry the shaped charge warhead, stabilize it in flight, and detonate it at the perfect distance. The question was whether you could make it simple enough for combat use. UHL's breakthrough came in a moment of inspiration. Rather than create a complex launcher, he realized you could use a simple steel tube. The rocket motor would do all the work. The tube was just a guide. It didn't need to withstand firing pressures like a gun barrel, because the rocket motor ignited after the projectile left the tube. This meant the launcher could be lightweight, open at both ends to vent the rocket backblast, and crude by artillery standards. Legend says Uhl created the first prototype by taking pieces of steel tubing from a scrap heap, some rocket motors, and a shaped charge warhead, then fitting them together almost like a plumber assembling pipes. He supposedly demonstrated it for Colonel Leslie Skinner by firing at a tank hulk, punching a clean hole through armor that anti-tank rifles couldn't touch. The entire weapon weighed about 15 pounds, light enough for one man to carry and fire. The army was desperate enough to approve immediate production. Within months, thousands of the weapons were being manufactured. Someone nicknamed it the bazooka, after a musical instrument carried by radio comedian Bob Burns, a name that stuck despite official designations like launcher, rocket, M1. The M1 Bazooka was crude by engineering standards. It was a 5-foot-long steel tube with primitive sights, a simple wooden handguard, and an electrical firing system powered by batteries. The rocket motor was basic solid fuel. The warhead used a simple contact fuse. There was no sophisticated guidance, no complex electronics. It was almost comically simple. But simplicity was its genius. You could train a soldier to use it in hours. It could be manufactured quickly with basic industrial capacity. It was reliable in field conditions. And most importantly, it worked. The M6 and M6A1 rockets could penetrate approximately 3 to 4 inches, 76 to 100 millimeters, of armor plate at effective ranges, more than enough to threaten the side or rear armor of any German tank when properly employed. The specifications were modest but sufficient for infantry use. Maximum range of approximately 300 to 400 yards, though effective combat range, where accuracy was reliable, was closer to 100 to 150 yards or less. The rocket motor burned for only a fraction of a second, accelerating the projectile to modest velocities. Accuracy was limited. This wasn't a precision weapon designed for long-range engagements. But you didn't need precision when engaging from close range with a warhead capable of penetrating side or rear armor of tanks. By late 1942, the first bazookas were shipping to North Africa. German intelligence would soon get reports of a new American anti-tank weapon. Those reports would be largely dismissed. After all, how dangerous could a simple tube weapon carried by infantry possibly be? When the M1 Bazooka first appeared in North Africa during Operation Torch in November 1942, its arrival was hasty and somewhat chaotic. The weapons were rushed to invasion forces with minimal training. General Eisenhower himself reportedly learned the night before the landings that his troops had received no instruction in the weapon's use. This inauspicious debut meant the bazooka's impact in the initial North African fighting was limited. German forces, however, soon encountered the weapon in combat. Some captured from Lend-Lease shipments to Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, others taken from American troops during early encounters in Tunisia. German intelligence reports from this period suggest initial skepticism. One assessment described it as appearing to be another infantry anti-tank rifle variant, unlikely to pose serious threats to German armor based on the weapon's visual simplicity. This assessment would prove costly. As American forces gained experience with the weapon through early 1943, reports of its effectiveness began to multiply. The weapon's true capabilities became apparent not through its technical specifications, which seemed modest, but through its combat results. German after-action reports from the Tunisian campaign document destroyed tanks and forced withdrawals, with increasing references to this new American rocket launcher. The psychological shift among German tank crews appears to have been gradual but significant. Armor that had provided reliable protection against previous Allied weapons could now be penetrated by infantry operating from concealed positions. The sense of invulnerability that had characterized German armored operations began to erode. One can infer from the urgency with which Germany pursued development of their own copy that the weapon's battlefield impact exceeded initial expectations. One pattern that emerges from combat reports was the effectiveness of bazooka ambushes. American infantry, learning the weapon's capabilities, would set up positions allowing them to engage armor from the side or rear. The shaped charge warhead's ability to penetrate side armor, typically thinner than frontal protection, meant that tanks previously considered nearly invulnerable could be destroyed by well-positioned infantry teams. German reports from Tunisia document this shift, with increasing emphasis on the need for infantry support to protect armor from these new threats. The Battle of Kasserine Pass. In February 1943, though primarily remembered as a German tactical victory that exposed American inexperience, also featured early bazooka employment. While American forces generally fell back during this engagement, there were instances where the new weapon successfully engaged German armor, providing at least some capability to contest armoured attacks, even in an overall defeat. As the North African campaign continued into spring 1943, German field reports underwent a notable transformation. The dismissive language of early assessments gave way to tactical caution. Tank commanders received instructions to avoid approaching American positions without infantry support. Doctrine began emphasizing standoff engagement ranges. These doctrinal changes suggest that whatever German officers initially thought of the bazooka's sophistication, its battlefield effectiveness had earned their respect. During the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, the M1 Bazooka, using improved M6A1 rockets, saw more extensive combat use. Reports document the weapon accounting for several German tanks, including at least one Tiger I heavy tank, knocked out by what appeared to be an improbable hit through the driver's vision slot. Such instances, while uncommon, demonstrated that even the heaviest German armour had vulnerabilities that a well-positioned infantryman could exploit. Perhaps most significantly, captured bazookas were quickly designated for priority evaluation rather than routine intelligence processing. This suggests that someone in German command recognized the weapon as more than just another piece of captured equipment. The specimens were sent to testing facilities with urgent directives, not merely to understand how it worked, but to determine whether Germany could produce something similar. The captured bazookas would have undergone intensive testing at German proving grounds. This was standard procedure for captured enemy weapons. Engineers would have fired them at various types of armor plate to measure penetration capability. They would have evaluated the shaped charge warheads, studied the rocket motor design, and assessed accuracy, reliability, and manufacturing requirements. With each test, German appreciation for the weapon's practical effectiveness likely grew. Based on what we know of German weapons testing protocols and the eventual Panzerschreck design, these evaluations would have included firings against captured Allied tanks and German armor samples. The results would have demonstrated that the bazooka could penetrate the side armor of virtually any tank at close range. Against rear armor, always thinner to save weight, it would have been even more effective. The only armor consistently defeating it would have been the frontal protection of the heaviest vehicles like Tigers and Panthers. And even then, hits on vision ports, seams, or other weak points could disable a vehicle. What these tests revealed was as much about design philosophy as about technical capability. The bazooka violated German engineering principles. It was rough, approximate in construction, designed for rapid mass production rather than precision. Yet, the test results would have shown it worked as well, or better, than more sophisticated alternatives. This represented a challenge to fundamental assumptions about weapons development. The reports from testing facilities would have reached high levels of German command. The subsequent priority given to Panzerschreck development demonstrates this was treated as an urgent matter. The conclusion that emerges from the timeline of events is clear. Germany needed its own version, and needed it quickly. The decision to base the design closely on the American original, rather than pursuing a more elaborate German redesign, speaks to the urgency of this need. To understand why the bazooka terrified German tank crews, you need to understand the physics of shaped charges, a principle that revolutionized anti-armor warfare and remains the basis for most anti-tank weapons today. Traditional armor-piercing rounds work through simple kinetic energy. Fire a hard, dense projectile at high velocity, and if it has enough energy, it can punch through steel. This is why anti-tank gun barrels kept getting longer and the rounds kept getting bigger. You needed more velocity, more mass, more energy. But there are practical limits. Eventually, the gun becomes too heavy to move, or the recoil becomes unmanageable, or the projectile becomes too expensive and complex to manufacture. Shaped charges, discovered by Charles Monroe in the 1880s, but not weaponized until World War II, work on an entirely different principle. Start with a hollow charge of high explosive, shaped like a cone or a bowl, with a metal liner inside that cone. When the explosive detonates, it doesn't just explode outward randomly. Instead, the detonation wave collapses the metal liner inward and forward, forming what's called a Monroe jet, or shaped charge jet. This jet is extraordinary. It's not really a solid projectile or even a liquid in the conventional sense. It's metal in a superplastic state, moving at velocities that can exceed 8,000 meters per second. That's roughly 25 times the speed of sound. At these velocities, both the jet and the target armor behave like fluids rather than solids. The jet doesn't punch through armor in a conventional sense. It hydrodynamically penetrates, flowing through the steel like a pressure washer through clay. The physics gets even stranger. The penetration depth of a shaped charge is largely independent of the standoff distance within limits and almost independent of the velocity at which the warhead is traveling when it hits. This means you can deliver a shaped charge with a slow rocket, like the bazooka did, and achieve the same penetration as if you'd fired it from a high-velocity gun. This was the key insight that made rocket-propelled anti-tank weapons practical. The bazooka's warhead used a relatively small shaped charge, only about 1.5 pounds of explosive, but it was optimized for penetration. The copper liner was precisely shaped to form the most effective jet. The standoff distance from the nose of the warhead to the actual shaped charge was calculated to allow the jet to form fully before hitting the target. The impact fuse was designed to detonate the charge at exactly the right moment. When a bazooka round hit a tank, here's what happened in microseconds. The nose cone would crumple on impact, triggering the piezoelectric fuse. The fuse would initiate the explosive. The detonation wave would collapse the copper liner into a jet, moving at hypersonic speed. This jet would contact the armor and begin penetrating, creating a narrow hole through the steel. The jet would continue through any interior components, ammunition racks, fuel tanks, crew members, with lethal effect. Finally, fragments of the metal jet and molten armor would spray into the crew compartment, often igniting fuel or ammunition and causing secondary explosions. The result was catastrophic for tank crews. Unlike a deflected anti-tank gun round that might just ring your ears, a bazooka penetration meant fire, fragmentation, and likely death. Even if the tank wasn't completely destroyed, it was often knocked out of action, and the crew, if they survived, was psychologically shattered. German engineers testing captured bazookas were particularly impressed by the penetration capability relative to the weapon's simplicity. A bazooka warhead could achieve penetrations of 75 to 100 millimeters, roughly 3 to 4 inches, of armor plate, sufficient to penetrate the side armor of most German tanks and comparable to what some larger and heavier anti-tank guns could achieve. The fact that this capability came in a package that weighed only about 15 pounds total could be carried by infantry and cost a fraction of what an anti-tank gun cost made it genuinely revolutionary. There were limitations, of course. Shaped charges were less effective against sloped armor because the penetration jet had to work through more steel at an angle. They could be defeated by spaced armor. 2 plates with a gap between them would disrupt the jet formation. And accuracy was poor beyond about 150 yards, meaning bazooka teams had to get dangerously close to their targets. But these limitations didn't diminish the weapon's revolutionary impact. The British had developed similar shaped charge weapons, the PIAT grenade launcher, but it was heavy, awkward, and difficult to use. The German Panzerfaust, developed later, used shaped charges in a disposable launcher format. But the bazooka struck the right balance between power, simplicity, and reusability that made it the template for future development. What made German engineers nervous wasn't just that the bazooka worked, it was that it represented a different approach to weapons design. German engineering culture emphasized precision, quality, and sophisticated solutions. The bazooka was none of those things. It was rough, simple, and pragmatic. Yet, it worked as well or better than more sophisticated German weapons. This was unsettling. It suggested that American industrial philosophy, which emphasized mass production of good enough weapons over perfectionist engineering, might actually be superior in total war. The transformation of German attitudes toward the bazooka from initial skepticism to serious concern happened over the course of months in early 1943. Captured examples arrived through two channels. Some were taken from Soviet forces who had received them through Lend-Lease programs in late 1942. Others were captured from American forces during the Tunisia campaign in early 1943. The directive from German High Command followed: develop a German equivalent. The time frame suggests urgency. By late 1943, the first Panzerschrecks were reaching combat units. But this presented the German weapons establishment with an uncomfortable reality. They would essentially be copying an American design, something that sat uneasily with a military culture that prided itself on technological leadership. The internal tension this created can be inferred from the development process. Some German engineers initially proposed developing a properly designed German anti-tank rocket system with enhanced accuracy, longer range, and more sophisticated features, the typical German approach to weapons development. However, battlefield necessity overruled engineering perfectionism. The Eastern Front desperately needed portable anti-tank weapons. Soviet armor was growing more numerous. There was no time for elaborate development programs. The result was the Raketen Panzerbuchse 54, quickly nicknamed the Panzerschreck, literally tank terror or tank fright. The name itself is revealing. Where the American nickname bazooka came from a comedian's musical instrument and had almost whimsical origins, the German name emphasized the weapon's battlefield psychological impact. This naming choice suggests that German troops and commanders understood the terror such weapons could inspire, because they had experienced it themselves. German engineers did make some genuine improvements, though whether these were truly better or just different is debatable. The Panzerschreck used a larger 88mm rocket rather than the bazooka's 60mm, giving it more powerful warheads with greater penetration. The launcher tube was slightly longer, theoretically improving accuracy. And German engineering being what it was, the weapon was somewhat more robustly constructed than the American original. But the Panzerschreck also had disadvantages that revealed the cost of German improvements. It was heavier, nearly 20 pounds versus the bazooka's 15. The larger rocket produced more backblast, requiring a protective shield for the gunner, adding more weight and complexity. Manufacturing was more time-consuming because German factories couldn't resist adding precision elements even when copying a weapon specifically designed for crude mass production. Perhaps most telling was the production timeline. Germany began seriously developing the Panzerschreck in mid-1943, with first deliveries in late 1943. By contrast, the Americans had gone from concept to combat deployment in less than a year. The German version took nearly as long despite having a working model to copy. This delay reflected both Germany's increasingly strained industrial capacity and the cultural difficulty of adopting American-style simplified production methods. When Panzerschrecks began reaching frontline units in late 1943 and early 1944, German soldiers' reactions were mixed. Those who'd faced Soviet tanks welcomed any portable anti-tank weapon with enthusiasm. The Panzerschreck could kill a T-34 or even heavier Soviet armor if you could get close enough. A massive improvement over the sense of helplessness that had pervaded German infantry facing Soviet armor superiority. But there was also a subtle psychological dimension. German propaganda had spent years emphasizing German technological superiority. The Panzerschreck was visible evidence that Germany was now copying American weapons, Some soldiers joked bitterly about how the primitive Americans had taught the master race something about weapons design. Others simply didn't care. They wanted something that would kill enemy tanks, and the Panzerschreck did that. The weapon saw extensive use on both the eastern and western fronts. On the eastern front, Panzerschreck teams became a critical part of German defensive doctrine, as the Wehrmacht shifted to fighting retreating actions. Infantry would allow Soviet tank columns to advance into urban areas or prepared positions, then attack from close range with Panzerschreck fire aimed at side and rear armor. These tactics inflicted significant losses on Soviet armor, though they couldn't change the fundamental trajectory of the war. On the Western Front after D-Day, Panzerschrecks proved valuable in the hedgerow fighting in Normandy. The close terrain limited Allied armor advantages, and German infantry could use the same ambush tactics that American soldiers had employed with bazookas in Italy. More than one American tanker learned to fear the Panzerschreck, the same way German tankers had learned to fear the bazooka. German production figures tell the story of how seriously the weapon was taken. Despite Germany's industrial capacity being hammered by Allied bombing, despite shortages of critical materials, despite competing priorities for every factory and resource, Germany produced roughly 290,000 Panzerschreck launchers and over 2 million rockets during the war. This represented a massive allocation of scarce resources to what was, essentially, a copy of an enemy weapon. The ultimate irony? By the time the Panzerschreck was in full production, American weapons designers had already improved the bazooka. The M9 and M20 Super Bazooka variants featured larger 88mm rockets, the same size as the Panzerschreck, along with improved launchers, better sights, and other refinements. The Americans had moved on, while the Germans were still copying the original design. This created a peculiar arms race, where each side copied and improved on the other's designs in rapid succession. The bazooka inspired the Panzerschreck, which influenced the Super Bazooka, which informed post-war Soviet RPG development, which influenced subsequent Western designs, creating a lineage that continues to this day. For German military planners, the Panzerschreck represented both tactical success and strategic lesson. Tactically, it gave German infantry an effective anti-tank weapon that helped counter some of the Allied armor advantage in the war's later stages. But strategically, the episode represented an admission that German engineering philosophy, emphasizing sophisticated, precision-crafted weapons, had been outmaneuvered by American pragmatism and mass production capability. Military historians examining this episode have noted the fundamental lesson. In total war, the weapon that can be mass-produced and effectively used by conscript soldiers often proves more valuable than the theoretically superior weapon that takes too long to make or requires expert handling. The Panzerschreck's development timeline, copying rather than innovating, demonstrated that Germany had learned this lesson, even if it came late in the war. The introduction of the bazooka and Panzerschreck fundamentally changed infantry armor dynamics, but this transformation required developing entirely new tactics, training methods, and combat doctrines. Neither weapon came with an instruction manual for how to use it effectively in the chaos of battle. American infantry units initially treated the bazooka somewhat like a rifle: aim, fire, hope for the best. Early training emphasized marksmanship and accuracy, as if the weapon were a precision instrument. Combat experience quickly taught different lessons. Bazookas were close-range ambush weapons, not long-range dueling tools. Effective tactics emerged from trial, error, and the accumulated wisdom of soldiers who survived their encounters with German armor. The primary tactical innovation was the two-man team concept, refined through combat experience. One soldier would carry and aim the weapon, while the second soldier would load rockets, spot targets, and provide security. This division of labor was crucial, because operating a bazooka under fire was complex and stressful. The gunner needed to focus on aiming and judging range while watching for tank movements. The loader needed to prepare rockets, remove safety pins, make electrical connections, and watch the gunner's back. Together, they functioned as a highly specialized hunting pair. Effective bazooka teams learned to think like predators stalking prey. Position was everything. You wanted to engage tanks from the side or rear where armor was thinnest. You needed cover both for the initial shot and for the escape route afterward, because firing a bazooka announced your position to every enemy within sight. You needed to be patient, sometimes letting closer, easier targets pass to wait for a higher value target or a better angle. Urban warfare provided ideal conditions for bazooka tactics. Cities and towns offered countless ambush positions. Cellars, upper floors, rubble piles, destroyed buildings. A bazooka team could hide, wait for armor to pass into the kill zone, fire from an unexpected angle, and then relocate before the enemy could respond. In Italy, and later in the urban fighting in Germany, these tactics proved devastatingly effective. German tankers learned to dread every window, every doorway, every pile of rubble that might conceal a bazooka team. The hedgerow country of Normandy presented different challenges, but similar opportunities. The dense bocage terrain limited visibility and channeled armor onto predictable paths. Bazooka teams would hide in the thick hedgerows, allow tanks to pass, then fire into the vulnerable rear armor at close range. The thick vegetation provided concealment for both the initial position and the withdrawal. Counter tactics emerged as German tankers adapted. Tank crews learned never to advance alone. Infantry support could spot and suppress bazooka teams before they could fire. Tanks began carrying extra machine guns to sweep suspicious positions with suppressive fire. They used high explosive rounds to destroy potential hiding spots. In urban environments, they'd fire into buildings randomly to kill or flush out anti-tank teams before advancing. Some German tank commanders developed a brutal but effective tactic. When taking fire from a building, they would simply collapse the entire structure with high explosive rounds, burying anyone inside. This made hiding in buildings riskier, but not impossible. Experienced bazooka teams learned to fire from positions with good escape routes and multiple exit points. Training programs evolved rapidly. American training camps built mock villages for urban warfare practice. Soldiers learned specific techniques: how to judge range without optical sights, how to lead moving targets, where to aim on different tank types for maximum effect. They learned the critical importance of the first shot. You rarely got a second chance against alert armor. They practiced rapid reloading under stress. They studied German tank types to identify vulnerable spots. Vision ports, engine decks, track assemblies, ammunition storage areas. Psychological preparation was crucial. It took courage to let a multi-ton tank approach within 100 yards before firing, knowing that if you missed or failed to penetrate, that tank would very likely kill you. Training emphasized staying calm, controlling breathing, waiting for the perfect moment. Some soldiers never managed this. They'd fire too early, from too far away, reducing effectiveness. The best bazooka gunners had nerves of steel and an almost predatory patience. German Panzerschreck tactics developed along similar lines, with some variations based on their defensive situations. On the Eastern Front, where German forces were increasingly fighting delaying actions, Panzerschreck teams became part of elaborate defensive systems. They'd allow Soviet tanks to advance into prepared kill zones, then hit them from multiple angles simultaneously. This required coordination and discipline, but could destroy or halt entire tank columns. One particularly effective German tactic was the Panzerschreck nest, a concealed position fortified to withstand indirect fire, manned by multiple teams with intersecting fields of fire. Soviet tanks entering the zone would face fire from several Panzerschrecks at once, making it difficult to suppress all positions. These nests were usually sighted with careful attention to escape routes, as staying in position after firing was generally fatal. Night operations added another dimension. Both bazookas and Panzerschrecks used rocket motors that created highly visible backblast signatures. Making night firing extremely risky, you essentially painted a target on yourself. But darkness also provided concealment for movement and positioning. Experienced teams learned to use flares, fires, or moonlight to silhouette targets while remaining hidden themselves. Some German teams would coordinate their attacks with artillery or mortar fire to mask the sound and flash of their weapons. Notable engagements demonstrated these evolved tactics. During the Battle of the Bulge, American bazooka teams played critical roles in slowing German armor at key points. At places like Bastogne, infantry armed with bazookas held positions that tanks alone couldn't have defended. One famous incident involved a single American soldier who destroyed 3 German tanks with a bazooka during a night attack, firing from different positions to create the illusion of multiple teams and causing the German attack to falter. On the Eastern Front, Panzerschreck teams contributed to some of the last effective German defensive victories. During the defense of Budapest in late 1944 and early 1945, German and Hungarian Panzerschreck teams inflicted heavy losses on Soviet armor in brutal urban fighting. The weapon's effectiveness in city combat was demonstrated repeatedly. One Soviet report noted that in urban operations, infantry with anti-tank rockets could be more dangerous than enemy tanks because they were harder to locate and suppress. By war's end, both sides had thoroughly internalized the lessons of rocket-propelled anti-tank warfare. Infantry doctrine now assumed that soldiers would have access to powerful portable anti-tank weapons. Tank doctrine assumed that infantry with such weapons were a primary threat requiring specific countermeasures. The relationship between infantry and armor had been fundamentally rebalanced. No longer were tanks invulnerable tyrants of the battlefield. They were powerful but vulnerable, and infantry armed with weapons like the bazooka could fight back effectively. This tactical evolution would continue into the post-war era, influencing development of weapons like the RPG series, modern anti-tank guided missiles, and current infantry anti-armor doctrine. The lessons learned with the bazooka and Panzerschreck remain relevant today. The bazooka's impact didn't end with World War II. Instead, it sparked an arms race in portable anti-tank weapons that continued throughout the Cold War and continues today. The concept, a man-portable rocket-propelled shaped charge weapon, proved so effective that every military in the world sought similar capabilities. American development continued immediately. The M20 Super Bazooka, introduced in the final months of World War II, increased the rocket diameter to 88 millimeters, matching the Panzerschreck, and introduced improved launchers with better sights and reliability. The M20 saw extensive use in Korea, where it proved effective against North Korean and Chinese armor. Though the M20 bore superficial resemblance to the Panzerschreck, it featured greater effective range and penetrating capability, while being considerably lighter. The M20 weighed approximately 14.3 pounds, 6.5 kilograms, compared to the Panzerschreck's 24 pounds, 11 kilograms, with blast shield. But even as the Super Bazooka entered service, weapons designers were exploring the next generation. The problem was that tanks continued to improve. By the 1950s, armor thickness and armor designs had advanced to the point where even improved bazookas struggled to guarantee kills. The solution was to move beyond unguided rockets toward guided missiles. The Soviet Union took a different path. Soviet weapons designers studied captured bazookas and Panzerschrecks extensively and concluded that the rocket-propelled, unguided weapon concept still had tremendous value, especially for Third World conflicts and guerrilla warfare. The result was the RPG series, the Rushnoy Protivotankovy Granatomayot, or handheld anti-tank grenade launcher. The RPG-2, introduced in 1949, was essentially a Soviet take on the bazooka concept, simplified even further. It was lighter than either the bazooka or Panzerschreck, used a larger 82mm warhead, and was designed for mass production, using the crudest available industrial capacity. The RPG-7, introduced in 1961, refined the concept further with a clever design that combined a recoilless launcher with a secondary rocket motor that ignited in flight, giving the weapon better range and accuracy while keeping it lightweight and simple. The RPG-7 became arguably the most successful infantry weapon design in history. Cheap, reliable, effective, and simple enough to use with minimal training, it proliferated throughout the world. From Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria, the RPG-7 proved that the basic concept pioneered by the bazooka, shoulder-fired, rocket-propelled, shaped charge, remained viable across 7 decades. The RPG-7 owes a direct conceptual debt to the bazooka, even though it incorporated numerous improvements and modifications. European nations developed their own variants. The French created the LRA-CF1. The British refined their recoilless rifle designs. The Swedes produced the Carl Gustaf series. Each represented different engineering philosophies, but all acknowledged the fundamental validity of portable anti-tank rocket weapons. The proliferation of bazooka-derived weapons changed guerrilla warfare and asymmetric conflicts. Insurgent and resistance forces throughout the Cold War sought anti-tank weapons because they provided small units with the ability to threaten armored vehicles. The Viet Cong used RPG-2s and RPG-7s extensively against American armor and helicopters. Afghan Mujahideen used RPG-7s to destroy Soviet armored vehicles. Modern insurgent forces continue to use various descendants of the original bazooka concept. This proliferation also influenced tank design throughout the post-war era. Tanks gained reactive armor designed to disrupt shaped charge jets. Composite armor incorporated materials specifically chosen to resist shaped charge penetration. Cage armor and slat armor were developed to pre-detonate shaped charge warheads before they reached main armor. All these countermeasures existed because the bazooka had proven that portable shaped charge weapons were a fundamental threat that couldn't be ignored. The doctrinal impact was equally profound. By demonstrating that infantry could effectively fight armor with man-portable weapons, the bazooka changed military thinking about combined arms operations. No longer could armor operate independently of infantry support. Tank doctrine had to account for the reality that every enemy infantryman might be carrying something capable of killing your tank. This forced integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support in ways that might not have developed otherwise. Modern anti-tank guided missiles, ATGMs, represent the next evolutionary step from the bazooka concept. Weapons like the American TOW, the Soviet Kornet, the Israeli Spike, and the Chinese HJ-8 use guided missiles with shaped charge warheads launched from portable platforms. They're far more sophisticated than the original bazooka, but the fundamental concept, portable weapon, explosive delivery system, shaped charge warhead, remains unchanged. Even today, new variations continue to appear. The Swedish NLAW, American Javelin, and Israeli Spike missiles represent cutting-edge technology, but they trace their conceptual lineage directly back to the M1 Bazooka. The same basic physics that made the bazooka effective, shaped charge penetration, remains the primary mechanism for defeating modern armor. The bazooka also influenced weapons outside pure anti-tank roles. The concept of man-portable rocket launchers proved useful for bunker busting, urban warfare, and attacking fortified positions. Modern weapons like the SMAW, shoulder-launched multi-purpose assault weapon, descend from both the bazooka and later recoilless rifle designs, demonstrating that the basic concept has applications beyond just killing tanks. In retrospect, the bazooka's most important contribution might not be any specific technical innovation, but rather the demonstration that simple, mass-produced weapons, optimized for effectiveness rather than perfection, could fundamentally change battlefield dynamics. This was a lesson American industry taught German engineering during World War II, a lesson that shaped weapons development for the next 80 years and continues to influence military thinking today. The M1 Bazooka occupies a unique place in military history, not because it was the most powerful weapon of World War II, or the most sophisticated, or the most revolutionary in pure technical terms. Its significance lies in what it represented: the democratization of anti-tank warfare and the triumph of pragmatic design over engineering perfectionism. Before the bazooka, anti-tank capability was the domain of specialists, crews manning heavy anti-tank guns, artillery batteries, or specialized tank destroyer units. The average infantryman facing armor was helpless, dependent on support assets that might not arrive in time. The bazooka changed this equation. Suddenly, any infantry squad could threaten armored vehicles. Any soldier with basic training could become a tank killer. The playing field hadn't leveled completely. Tanks remained formidable, but it had shifted significantly toward the defender. This democratization had strategic implications that extended beyond any single battle. Germany's armored forces, which had terrorized Europe with their apparent invincibility, suddenly faced a weapon that could be distributed by the thousands, carried by ordinary soldiers, and employed without complex training or support structures. The psychological impact on German tankers was real and measurable. Suddenly, every combat operation involved scanning for threats that could come from anywhere. The cultural lesson was equally significant. German engineering culture prided itself on precision, quality, and sophisticated solutions. The bazooka violated every principle of this approach. It was crude, simple, designed for mass production rather than perfection. Yet, it worked as well, or better, than more sophisticated alternatives. For German engineers forced to copy American design, this was professionally humiliating. But it demonstrated a crucial truth about total war. The weapon you can produce in quantity and deploy effectively often trumps the theoretically superior weapon that's too complex or resource-intensive to produce at scale. This lesson influenced post-war weapons development globally. The AK-47 assault rifle embodied similar design philosophy: simple, reliable, effective, mass-producible. The RPG series followed the same principles. Throughout the Cold War, weapons designers increasingly recognized that in modern warfare, good enough weapons available in quantity often beat perfect weapons available in limited numbers. The bazooka also established shaped charges as the primary anti-armor mechanism for infantry weapons, a position they still hold today. While kinetic energy penetrators remain important for tank main guns, infantry anti-tank weapons universally rely on shaped charge warheads. The physics that made the bazooka effective in 1943 remain relevant in 2025. Modern warheads are more sophisticated, with tandem charges to defeat reactive armor and other refinements. But the core principle is unchanged. Culturally, the bazooka entered American consciousness as an icon of the citizen soldier fighting back against mechanized tyranny. It appeared in countless war movies, usually in scenes where heroic GIs knocked out German tanks against impossible odds. This romanticized image often missed the terror and complexity of actually using the weapon in combat, but it reflected a deeper truth. The bazooka empowered ordinary soldiers to fight back against seemingly overwhelming force. The weapon's name itself became part of popular culture. Bazooka entered the English language as a term for any shoulder-fired rocket launcher, used in contexts ranging from military history to video games. This linguistic legacy reflects the weapon's iconic status. How many other weapons are universally known by their nickname rather than their official designation? For veterans who used the weapon, reactions were mixed. Some remembered it with gratitude, as the weapon that gave them a fighting chance against German armor. Others recalled the terror of letting a tank approach within effective range, knowing that a miss or a malfunction meant almost certain death. All agreed it changed how infantry thought about fighting tanks, transforming them from terrifying predators to dangerous but vulnerable targets. The bazooka's most profound legacy might be demonstrating the limits of technological superiority. Germany entered World War II with legitimate advantages in armored warfare: better tanks, better tactics, better training. These advantages created an aura of invincibility that was as much psychological as practical. A simple American weapon, developed in less than a year, manufactured by the tens of thousands, and distributed to ordinary infantrymen, shattered that aura. It proved that innovation, industrial capacity, and pragmatic design could overcome initial technological deficits. This lesson has echoed through subsequent conflicts. In Vietnam, simple RPGs threatened sophisticated American tanks and helicopters. In Afghanistan, RPG-7s in the hands of Mujahideen fighters challenged Soviet armored forces. In Iraq and Syria, improvised anti-armor weapons, based on similar principles, continue to threaten modern armor. The basic dynamic established by the bazooka, that portable, simple shaped charge weapons give infantry effective anti-armor capability, remains a fundamental feature of modern warfare. Today, 80-plus years after its introduction, the bazooka's conceptual descendants are standard equipment for virtually every military force in the world. From sophisticated guided missiles like the Javelin to crude RPG-7 variants, the basic concept, portable launcher, explosive propulsion, shaped charge warhead, dominates infantry anti-armor weapons. Even as active protection systems and advanced armor try to counter these weapons, the fundamental arms race set in motion by the bazooka continues. The weapon also offers a cautionary tale about underestimating adversaries. German forces initially dismissed the bazooka as crude and ineffective, a judgment based more on engineering prejudice than tactical analysis. This underestimation cost German armor dearly, and forced Germany to divert scarce resources to copying a weapon they'd initially mocked. Modern militaries remember this lesson. Never underestimate a simple weapon in the hands of determined opponents, and never assume technological sophistication automatically translates to battlefield superiority. The story of the M1 Bazooka and the German Panzerschreck is ultimately a story about hubris, adaptation, and the unexpected consequences of technological innovation. German forces entered World War II confident in their armor superiority, a confidence built on legitimate technological advantages and early victories. When American engineers produced a crude tube weapon that could threaten that superiority, the initial German response was mockery, a response that proved costly and short-sighted. What makes this story resonant beyond the specific military history is what it reveals about innovation and design philosophy. The Germans weren't wrong that the bazooka was crude by conventional engineering standards. It was crude. What they missed was that crudeness could be a feature rather than a bug, that a weapon optimized for mass production, simplicity, and effectiveness, rather than precision and sophistication, might actually be superior in the context of total war. The transformation of German attitudes, from contempt to respect to imitation, happened remarkably quickly, driven by the harsh teacher of combat experience. Each destroyed panzer, each after-action report from the front, each captured bazooka that underwent testing, reinforced the lesson that American industrial pragmatism had produced something genuinely threatening. The decision to copy the design, humiliating as it might have been for German engineers, was the right tactical choice, but it also represented a strategic admission that German engineering philosophy might not be inherently superior. For American forces, the bazooka provided more than just an effective weapon. It provided psychological empowerment. Infantry who had felt helpless against German armor suddenly had the means to fight back. This shift in confidence was as important as the actual tank kills the weapon achieved. An army that believes it can fight is fundamentally different from an army that feels helpless, and the bazooka contributed to that crucial psychological transformation. The arms race that followed, from bazooka to Panzerschreck to super bazooka to RPG to modern ATGMs, demonstrates how a single, innovative weapon can reshape military technology for generations. Each iteration built on lessons from the previous generation, but all trace their lineage back to that original crude American tube weapon that German forces initially dismissed. The lesson extends beyond military technology. In any field, engineering, business, art, there's a tension between sophisticated complexity and pragmatic simplicity. Sometimes the sophisticated solution is genuinely better, but sometimes, especially under resource constraints or time pressure, the simple solution that's good enough and can be deployed at scale beats the perfect solution that takes too long or costs too much. The bazooka proved this principle at the highest possible stakes. Today, when you see footage of modern conflicts showing infantry with shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, you're seeing the legacy of the bazooka. When military planners design tanks with reactive armor and active protection systems specifically to counter shaped charge weapons, they're responding to the threat the bazooka established. When armies train infantry in anti-armor tactics, they're teaching refined versions of techniques first developed by bazooka teams in Tunisia and Italy. The German soldiers who mocked the bazooka learned their lesson quickly and painfully. The ones who survived remembered that lesson. Never underestimate a simple weapon. Never assume engineering sophistication equals battlefield superiority. And never, ever dismiss enemy innovation just because it doesn't match your own design philosophy. In the end, the M1 Bazooka proved that sometimes the best weapon isn't the most sophisticated one. It's the one that works well enough, can be built quickly, and can be used effectively by ordinary soldiers under terrible conditions. That's a lesson the Germans learned the hard way. And it's a lesson that remains relevant wherever innovation meets practical application. The crude American tube weapon that German troops mocked changed armored warfare forever. It forced Germany to copy an enemy design. It empowered Allied infantry. And it established design principles that continue to influence weapons development 80 years later. Not bad for a simple steel tube and some rockets assembled in less than a year. Sometimes, simple really does beat sophisticated, especially when that simplicity comes with a shaped charge warhead capable of punching through the best armor in the world.